Pam Bondi had built her career on tackling high-profile cases, earning a reputation as a relentless prosecutor who never backed down from a challenge. With years in the legal trenches, she had seen corruption in many forms, but today felt different. As she stepped into the grand courtroom, the air was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the case before her. The defendant, a powerful real estate developer with deep political ties, stood accused of funneling state funds into his private projects, a crime that, if proven, could send shockwaves through the highest levels of government. The evidence was substantial: financial records, contracts, and testimony that painted a damning picture of systemic fraud. This was not just another case. It was a battle for accountability in a system where wealth and influence often determined the outcome more than justice itself. But as formidable as the case was, Pam knew that her biggest challenge wouldn't come from the defense. It would come from the man presiding over the trial, Judge Howard Gates. Infamous for his sharp tongue, unpredictable rulings, and rumored connections to powerful figures, Gates was not the kind of judge who simply upheld the law. He was a force of his own, known for dismantling cases before they even got off the ground and wielding his authority like a weapon. Many attorneys had fallen victim to his ruthless courtroom tactics, their arguments shredded by his biting remarks before they had a chance to build momentum. He had a reputation for burying cases that threatened the wrong people, and Pam had no illusions about what she was walking into. The moment she approached the plaintiff's table, she could feel his presence looming over the proceedings, an unseen force, setting the tone before a single word was spoken. The courtroom itself was a testament to the stakes at hand. Rows of polished wooden benches lined with spectators, reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, and a jury carefully selected to weigh the facts against a defendant whose resources could buy the best legal defense money could afford. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for the case itself, but for the showdown between Pam Bondi and Judge Gates. She had spent the night before reviewing every piece of evidence, every legal precedent that might come into play, knowing full well that Gates would find any excuse to undercut her. She had watched recordings of his past trials, noting his patterns, how he would lull attorneys into a false sense of security before striking with a well-timed remark, how he would lean back in his chair, feigning boredom, before abruptly cutting them off mid-sentence. He didn't just rule from the bench, he played the game, bending the courtroom dynamic to his will. But Pam Bondi had faced men like him before. She wasn't just here to argue a case, she was here to fight for the integrity of the justice system itself. As the trial commenced and Gates barely looked up from his files before delivering his first dismissive remark, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. This was going to be war. From the moment Judge Howard Gates took his seat, his disdain for Pam Bondi was palpable. He barely glanced up as she approached the plaintiff's table, flipping through a file with deliberate slowness, his silence stretching just long enough to send a clear message. He was in control, and she was an inconvenience. Finally, with a sigh that seemed more for show than necessity, he spoke without lifting his gaze. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, mostly from the defense team, emboldened by the judge's blatant dismissal. Bondi ignored them, keeping her posture straight, her expression neutral. She had dealt with worse. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Gates finally looked up, his lips curling into something between amusement and boredom. "Taxpayer dollars, right?" he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." A murmur spread through the gallery, a mixture of surprise and intrigue. Judges could be tough, even abrasive, but this was something else. This was personal. Bondi's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." Their eyes met for the briefest of moments. His cold and calculating, hers unwavering. But before she could continue, he cut her off again, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Miss Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point." "I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." This time, the reaction in the room was more pronounced. A few spectators exchanged glances, the quiet rustling of papers from the jury indicating their growing unease. Gates was known for being curt, but this was different. There was an edge to it, a deliberate effort to discredit her before she had even begun. Bondi took a slow breath, recalibrating. He wanted her off balance, wanted to dictate the tempo of the trial, but she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She picked up a folder from the table and flipped it open with precision. Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate— Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork? Gates interrupted. Or is this just your way of compensating? The words landed heavily, a blatant attempt to belittle her. A few smirks flickered across the faces of the defense attorneys. Reporters in the gallery exchanged quick, knowing glances, and even some jurors shifted uncomfortably. But Bondi didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation, that their power came not from their authority, but from the reactions they provoked. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. She paused, not long enough to appear shaken, but just enough to make a statement. Then, instead of responding to his insult, she simply set the folder down and clasped her hands together. Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have. The words were careful, measured, neither aggressive nor disrespectful, but unmistakably point a subtle warning that she was not here to be pushed around. The judge's lips curled slightly. Amusement, annoyance, it was hard to tell. Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one. This time the murmurs were louder. Someone in the gallery whispered something under their breath. The tension was no longer just palpable, it was tangible, thick enough to be felt by everyone in the room. Pam could see the shift happening, could sense the weight of the room turning as eyes flicked between her and Gates like spectators at a tennis match. But she didn't take the bait. She adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and met his gaze without hesitation. Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking. For the first time, something flickered in Gates' expression, something deeper than arrogance, something more than mere condescension. It was the look of a man who had a stake in the outcome of this case, who wasn't just playing courtroom theatrics for the sake of it. And that was when she knew this wasn't just about control. This was about hiding something. But what he didn't know was that she had come prepared for exactly this kind of fight. Pam Bondi remained unfazed as she turned to the next set of documents, carefully unfolding the financial records that exposed the extent of the fraud at hand. The evidence was irrefutable. Discrepancies in funding allocations, inconsistencies in accounting records, and clear indications that the defendant's company had received nearly triple the amount originally approved in the state budget. She stepped forward, her voice even and deliberate as she gestured toward the projection screen displaying the figures. Your Honor, these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received payments far exceeding the approved budget, and none of it was accounted for in state records. She clicked to the next slide, showing the transaction logs in stark contrast to the approved budget reports. But before she could continue, Gates leaned forward, his fingers tapping idly on the bench, his tone oozing with exaggerated patience. Miss Bondi, I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. The smirk on the defense attorney's face widened ever so slightly, as if he had been expecting the interruption. Bondi, however, wasn't about to let this slide. She glanced at Gates, then back at the screen, maintaining her composure. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case. Gates scoffed, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. Right, and yet, I fail to see anything here that justifies wasting the court's time like this. There it was again, that phrase, wasting the court's time. Bondi didn't miss the way his words were carefully chosen, not just to dismiss her argument, but to discredit the entire case in front of everyone. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the sound of her prosecution team shifting, exchanging uneasy glances. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Taking a breath, Bondi tightened her grip on her pen and flipped to the next page in her file. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to— Denied! Gates interjected before she could even finish. Silence. The air in the courtroom shifted, the tension tightening like a coiled spring. Bondi looked up, her expression unreadable. "I haven't even stated the motion yet." Gates exhaled sharply, his irritation now barely concealed. "And yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption." This time, the murmur in the room wasn't just curiosity, it was unease. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was paying attention now. Bondi squared her shoulders, her tone calm, measured. "Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents?" A pause, a beat too long. Gates hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer." Bondi didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, she reached for another document and placed it under the projector. "Very well, Your Honor, then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." The screen flickered as she displayed a contract signed between the defendant's company and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. "This document," she continued, "shows the expected cost at just over $2 million. She paused, letting the number settle, before placing another sheet on top of it. "However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount." The gallery stirred, whispers breaking the silence. But Bondi wasn't finished. With a steady hand, she placed a third document down. "And this," she let the moment stretch, her voice unwavering, "is the approval signature signed off by Judge Howard Gates." The reaction was immediate, a ripple of movement, eyes darting, pens scratching across paper as reporters scribbled furiously. The defense attorney stiffened, his smirk vanishing in an instant, but it was Gates's reaction that confirmed everything. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, his face was completely unreadable. That silence told her more than any outburst ever could. He wasn't just obstructing the case for sport. He had something to hide. And now, he knew that she knew. Pam Bondi let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer, letting the weight of the revelation settle across the courtroom. The document before her, illuminated by the projection screen, was undeniable. Judge Howard Gates' own signature approving the unauthorized financial transaction that had funneled millions into the defendant's. The initial stir of the gallery turned into a murmur, reporters' pens scratching furiously against their notepads as they absorbed the full magnitude of what had just been presented. The defense attorney, who had been sitting comfortably, his confidence evident in his smirk for most of the trial, was now frozen, his hands tightening around the edges of his notes, his eyes darting between the judge and the evidence displayed for everyone to see. But it was Judge Gates's reaction that held the most significance. For the first time since the hearing had begun, he did not lean back in his chair with feigned boredom, did not scoff or interrupt with a dismissive remark. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. His hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had been controlling the tempo of this trial from the start, throwing roadblocks in Bondi's path at every turn. But now, for the first time, he was the one caught off guard. Bondi could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of how much damage had just been done and what his next move should be. Every person in the courtroom was watching, waiting, the air thick with the collective understanding that something monumental had just occurred. The tension was suffocating, and then, at last, Gates spoke. "That document," he said slowly, deliberately, "is inadmissible." His voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it, a barely concealed desperation lurking beneath the surface. Bondi tilted her head, studying him. "How so, Your Honor?" she asked, her tone measured, careful. "It was obtained improperly," he replied, his gaze finally locking onto hers. "I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." A hush fell over the room, but it was not the hush of order being restored. It was the hush of disbelief, of realization. Gates had barely glanced at the document before making his ruling, had not asked for clarification, had not entertained a single argument. The jury shifted in their seats, some exchanging uncertain glances, their doubt growing with every second of silence that followed. Even the bailiff, standing rigidly by the door, appeared uneasy. This was not how a fair trial was conducted, and everyone in the room knew it. Bondi straightened, crossing her arms. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office through the proper legal channels." Her words were firm, but she was not arguing. She was exposing. Gates' nostrils flared slightly, his lips pressing into a thin, hard line. "Then it was mishandled," he shot back. "Either way, I'm striking it from the record." This time, the reaction was audible. Gasps, whispers, the sound of one of the jurors shifting so abruptly that their chair scraped against the floor. Bondi held her ground, watching as the carefully maintained image of an impartial judge began to crack under the weight of the truth. He wasn't ruling based on law. He was ruling based on fear. He was trying to bury this case before it could go any further, and in doing so he had just confirmed what she had suspected all along. He wasn't just an obstacle, he was part of the corruption. Slowly, Bondi exhaled, then took a calculated step back, allowing the room to absorb the reality of what had just happened. "You do realize this is a public hearing, correct?" she said at last, her voice level but pointed. "That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason?" She let the statement hang, knowing she didn't need to add anything more. The damage had already been done, not to her case, but to him. Gates clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on the bench. The composure he had wielded so effectively throughout the trial was slipping, unraveling thread by thread in front of an audience that no longer viewed him as an impartial figure of authority. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, reconsidering. He was cornered. For the first time in his career, Howard Gates was the one under scrutiny. Pam Bondi knew the courtroom had already shifted against Judge Gates, but she wasn't done yet. With deliberate precision, she reached into her case, pulling out a small recording device, placing it on the table where everyone could see it. The movement alone sent a fresh wave of tension rippling through the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, controlled, yet carrying a quiet authority that cut through the thick silence. "If there is any concern regarding the admissibility of the previous document, perhaps this will clarify matters." She pressed play. A low static crackled through the speakers before a voice emerged, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The recording continued, the voice sharper now, impatient. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. A collective inhale. A shocked murmur spreading like wildfire, reporters scrambling to scribble notes, jurors shifting forward in their seats. The defense attorney, who up until now had worn an air of smug confidence, looked pale, his hands clenching into fists on the table. But the most telling reaction of all was from Gates himself. His face had gone rigid, his already whitened knuckles pressing against the polished wood of his bench. He didn't speak, didn't move, but the flicker of panic in his eyes betrayed him. Bondi let the silence stretch, let the weight of the evidence settle before she spoke again, her voice calm but relentless. "Your Honor," she said, "can you confirm whether or not this is your voice?" It was a formality, of course. Every person in that room already knew the answer. Every reporter in the gallery was frantically noting down their headlines. The jury, who had been instructed to weigh the facts impartially, now sat wide-eyed, their earlier skepticism replaced by the undeniable truth playing through the speakers. Gates finally moved, clearing his throat, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "This is inadmissible," he said, his tone low but edged with something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. Bondi tilted her head slightly. "On what grounds?" she asked, her expression neutral, but her eyes never leaving his. This recording was obtained legally, submitted as evidence under the proper procedures. She paused just enough for the tension to build before continuing. "Unless, of course, you would like to argue that this recording is fabricated." Another stretch of silence. Gates's jaw clenched. He was trapped and he knew it. His authority, the very thing he had used to control the courtroom, to intimidate, to bury this case, was crumbling beneath him. If he denied the voice was his, he would be lying under oath, a perjury charge waiting to happen. If he admitted it, he was finished. The weight of the moment settled in his expression, the dawning realization that, for the first time, he had no move left to make. The room watched, the anticipation thick enough to choke on. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. Bondi didn't need him to. She simply pressed stop on the recorder. The silence it left behind louder than any outburst could have been. The damage was done. The courtroom had heard everything. The case was no longer just about corruption. It was about the man who had tried to cover it up, and everyone knew it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The weight of what had just transpired settling over everyone like a suffocating fog. Judge Howard Gates, once an untouchable figure of authority, now sat motionless, his carefully constructed facade shattered by the undeniable proof of his corruption. The jury, who had initially listened with measured skepticism, now stared at him with something resembling disgust. Reporters in the gallery were frantically typing, knowing they had just witnessed the downfall of a man who had spent years controlling the very system meant to uphold justice. The defense attorney, who had once smirked at Bondi's every word, now looked as if he wanted to disappear into his seat, realizing his client's fate was no longer the biggest story in the room. Bondi, however, did not gloat, did not revel in the destruction of a powerful man. Instead, she stood firm, the embodiment of professionalism and purpose. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "given the conflict of interest now evident in these proceedings, I formally request a recess so that this court may determine the appropriate next steps." But everyone already knew what that meant. Gates would not preside over another moment of this case, and likely not over another trial for the rest of his career. The bailiff shifted, awaiting the inevitable, and then, before Gates could issue another word, another excuse, the doors to the courtroom swung open as two uniformed officers stepped inside. A ripple of reaction moved through the spectators, a sharp intake of breath as realization dawned. This was more than just an exposed scandal. This was an immediate reckoning. The officers moved purposefully, their presence a clear indication that decisions had already been made beyond the courtroom walls. Gates didn't argue, didn't protest, but the deep clench of his jaw, the rigidity in his posture, told everyone that this was a man who had spent years wielding unchecked power and had never imagined he would one day answer for it. As they approached, he finally spoke, but it was not with the authority he had wielded just moments before. "This is a mistake," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But it wasn't, and he knew it. As the officers placed him in handcuffs, the gallery erupted, some in hushed whispers of disbelief, others in murmured affirmations that justice had finally prevailed. Cameras flashed, the rapid shutter clicks documenting the very moment a man who had once dictated the fates of others now faced his own. Bondi watched, her expression unreadable, but in her eyes was something unmistakable. Resolve. This was more than just another win in the courtroom. This was proof that even the most untouchable figures could be held accountable, that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be uprooted. And as she gathered her files, straightening them with quiet precision, she knew that this victory was not just hers, but for every person who had ever doubted that justice could be served against those who had spent their lives bending the law in their favor. The story of Pam Bondi's unwavering pursuit of justice against a corrupt judge carries profound lessons that extend far beyond the courtroom. It is a testament to the power of resilience, integrity, and the unwavering belief that truth must always prevail, no matter how formidable the opposition. For seniors who have spent a lifetime witnessing the complexities of justice, politics, and human nature, this story serves as a reminder that corruption thrives when people remain silent, but it crumbles when confronted with courage and determination. Pam Bondi's refusal to be intimidated, even by a figure as powerful as Judge Gates, underscores the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. In life, there will always be those who abuse their authority, who manipulate the system for their own gain. But history has shown that individuals with integrity can challenge and dismantle even the most entrenched corruption. This lesson is particularly relevant in today's world, where misinformation, dishonesty, and power struggles often overshadow the values of honesty and accountability. It reminds us that true change comes not from complacency, but from the willingness to ask difficult questions, to challenge injustices, and to demand transparency. For seniors who have lived through decades of societal shifts and have seen both progress and setbacks, the story reinforces the value of wisdom and experience in recognizing deceit and standing up for what is right. It also speaks to the importance of legacy, of ensuring that future generations inherit a world where truth is not suppressed and where those who misuse their power are held accountable. Many seniors have been mentors, parents, and community leaders, guiding younger generations with their knowledge and principles. This story is a call to continue that role, to pass on the message that doing the right thing is never easy, but always necessary. Whether it's in the realm of law, politics, or everyday life, justice requires vigilance, and morality requires action. Ultimately, Pam Bondi's triumph is a universal reminder that no one is above the law, and that persistence, when backed by truth, has the power to bring even the most powerful to justice. It is a story of hope, proving that, no matter how difficult the fight, integrity will always be the strongest force in the end.